Hello, everyone. Happy Friday morning, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and this is video number 2 entitled Why Wright, that is N.T. Wright, is wrong. Let me reiterate something that I said at the very introduction in video number 1. I have the greatest respect in many, many ways for Dr. Wright. I read his books. I have many, many of his books. Some of them are on my desk even as I speak, and I've got one shelf in there dedicated to his books. And so, in review of his views, I'm not attacking Dr. Wright personally in any way whatsoever. I am questioning his doctrine. And that's all in the world that I am doing. Now, at the very outset, I made mention to you that what I'm going to be addressing, I'm certainly not going to be addressing all of Dr. Wright's theology. That's not the point. That would be an unending story. What I will be addressing in this series, and I'm going to try to keep it relatively short, is his view that mankind is waiting for the material, physical redemption of creation. That includes the literal, physical, material universe, or as I sometimes like to say, the redemption of bugs, slugs, and mosquitoes. Now, this is a popular view, as I have pointed out. Richard Middleton takes that as an amillennialist. Kissinger takes this, I'll get that right in a moment. Riddlebarger, I'll get that right. Riddlebarger takes that position. Many other scholars take this position. It's interesting that in my fellowship of the Churches of Christ, as a young man, you never, ever, ever heard this view. It was viewed as absolutely false. One of the very first Church of Christ ministers, considered to be a scholar, that I ever read or heard take this view was a minister by the name of Jim McGuigan. I heard him make a presentation in a town called Wewoka, Oklahoma, and he was talking about Romans chapter 8, and he was talking about 2 Peter chapter 3. And believe you me, I had never, ever heard or read a single Church of Christ minister ever broach the subject of the idea that material creation will one day be redeemed and we will have a materialistic, earthly utopia. I sat there literally stunned, and I can tell you what, there were lots and lots of other people in that audience that were literally stunned to hear a Church of Christ minister, a millennialist, advocate a yet future renovation, renewal of the material, physical creation. Since then, that view, and Dr. Wright is certainly not the only one that has espoused that view, and he's certainly not a member of the Churches of Christ, but his influence has continued to grow in the Churches of Christ. Some few years ago, 2016, 2017, I had 2 formal debates with Dr. David Hester of Faulkner University. And it became evident in those debates that Dr. Hester has adopted N.T. Wright's view of the redemption of material creation. So when I addressed the views of N.T. Wright about a coming time in which there's going to be the redemption of material creation, I'm not isolating him. I am actually addressing a wider held view in the amillennial, the postmillennial, and even in the dispensational world. It is a common view. Now, in video number 1, I shared with you that Dr. Wright takes the position that, and really in a lot of ways, this is fundamental. I mean, this is bedrock foundation for Dr. Wright. His view is it is absolutely false to say and to teach that the Christian hope is the hope of dying and going to heaven. He says, point number one, that is based upon a false view of the human body. More on that momentarily. Secondarily, he says, and I'm not going to try to cite all of the passages from the various works of Dr. Wright. If you would like some documentation for some of the things that I say, feel free to contact me. And here in just a moment, I am going to read from some of his different sources and give the documentation. But for every single thing that I say that Dr. Wright says, I'm not going to document it. But I can, all right? So, N.T. Wright says it is wrong to say that heaven is the hope of the church. And again, he says that doctrine is based upon a mistaken view of the human body. And again, I'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, that raises the question, is heaven how shall I express this? I thought about this a lot before beginning the video this morning. Is heaven a, quote, secondary view or secondary hope of the Christian? And the reason that we have to ask this question is because in one of his lectures, Dr. Wright says, I'm not saying that heaven is bad. It's just not the end game. And he makes the comment in that video lecture, and again, I can provide the link for that if you wish. But Dr. Wright says, okay, so what happens to the faithful Christian where they die? They have to go somewhere. And he even admits, well, you can say we go to paradise, and you can even call it heaven if you like. And I would respond to that by saying, thank you very much. So if the Christian, when they die, goes to paradise, goes to heaven, and if that's not a bad thing, but it's not the ultimate goal, then it's a secondary hope. And I am forced to ask the question, how can going to heaven, and by the way, he understands, Dr. Wright understands, you don't have to have a physical body. You don't have to have a transformed, immortal, incorruptible body to go to heaven. Do you catch the power of that? So Dr. Wright understands that when a Christian dies, they go to heaven. So here is my question for you to ponder. If it is true that when a Christian dies, they go to heaven in the very direct presence of the Father and of the Son, and they enjoy there the fellowship and the blessings of the presence of God and the fellowship of untold millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of fellow Christians and saints, both Old Testament and New, and they get to do that without a physical body, why is it necessary for that Christian to leave heaven and to come back to earth to get a physical body that he never needed to be in the presence of God in order to then dwell on earth in the presence of Christ? What is better about being in the presence of Christ on earth than being in the presence of God and the Father and the Son in heaven? What is better? Because after all, if you're going to affirm, as Dr. Wright does, that heaven is not the primary goal, but earth is, then you're going to have to be able to explain what is better about earth than heaven itself. And let me remind you that last week I pointed out that in Hebrews chapter 6, The author says that it was God's intent that by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we may have great consolation. Those of us who have fled for refuge, to lay hold, now watch this, to lay hold of the hope set before us. Now watch this. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which enters into that which is within the veil. Well, what is within the veil? The most holy place. What is the most holy place? It's heaven. So, those who have fled for refuge to Christ, and they have done so to lay hold on the hope set before us, the hope that is within the veil, the hope that is in the most holy place. Now watch this, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus. Now that word forerunner is prodromos. And as I suggested last week, ever so briefly, that word means just exactly like it is translated in the New King James. It means the forerunner. Some older translations said the pioneer, the path maker. The point being, it means the one who goes before to make the way ready. So the hope is in heaven. Was in heaven. But you see, here's something critical, ladies and gentlemen. That was a hope that when Hebrews was written was not a fulfilled hope. As long as the old law existed, there was no entrance into that which was within the veil. Why? Well, because there was no forgiveness of sin. So please catch the power of this. As long as Torah stood valid, there was no forgiveness. As long as there was no forgiveness, there was no entrance into the most holy place. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that the removal of Torah and the forgiveness of sin was the hope of the Old Covenant saints. And when that forgiveness of sin arrived, that means you and I, under the New Covenant, can enter into that which is within the veil. And the book of Revelation, chapter 11, verse 15 and following, Revelation chapter 15, 8 and following, puts the entrance into the most holy place, the naos, at the time of the destruction of Babylon, the city where the Lord was crucified. Now, I hope you follow that train of thought here. When Hebrews was written, that which was in the veil was strictly a hope, an unfulfilled hope, because they were waiting for the removal of Torah. They were waiting to receive the full forgiveness of their sin. And thus the writer could say, let us therefore enter into the most holy place in full confidence of our faith, full assurance of our faith. Why? Because the removal of the old covenant and the coming of the high priest out of the most holy place to bring redemption, to bring salvation, which is nothing less than forgiveness, that time was coming in a very, very little while. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 37. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that which was a hope in Hebrews chapter 6, that which was in the veil, which was their hope, is now fulfilled because Christ has come. And it's not a secondary or even a tertiary type of hope. It was what the writer says, that is the hope. When he wrote, it was the hope, and encouraged them to stay steadfast and sure until the coming of the Lord, when that hope, entrance into the most holy place, heaven itself, would be fulfilled. And thus Paul could write in Philippians chapter 1, 19 and following, I am torn between two things, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Far better than what? remaining and being with you, which is far better for you, Paul could say, but departing and being with Christ. Well, where's Christ? In heaven. And some people try to use this passage, against preterists and say, oh, well, see, that was written before AD 70. Well, you got to understand, and we have to conflate passages. Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 4, 6 and following, Paul says, I've fought a good fight, I've finished the course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord shall give to me in that day. And not to me only, but to all of those who love his appearance. So when did Paul say he would actually receive that crown of righteousness, i.e., being with Christ? It would be at the day of the Lord. So here is Paul not saying, hey, look, I know that I'm about to die and go to heaven, which is okay, but it's not the end all be all, because one of these millennia, I'm going to come back to earth. And I'm going to dwell in the presence of Christ. Of course, in the meantime, I'm going to be in the presence of Christ, but that's not good enough. Now, I'm not trying to be facetious here, ladies and gentlemen. But you see, all of this stems back to the issue and the question of Dr. Wright's view of death. Now, I want to read to you a few quotes that illustrate, may I use the term ever so kindly, of schizophrenia on the part of Dr. Wright. And not just of Dr. Wright, but of the entire futurist world. Because you see, Dr. Wright says, the futurist view of dying and going to heaven is based upon the idea that the human body is cursed. It's unclean. So we've got to lay off the human body, and we just get to go to heaven when we die. Guess what? Dr. Wright believes when we lay off the human body, we go to heaven and we are with God. That's a bad thing. So here on the one hand, Dr. Wright condemns futurists because he says futurists have a low view of the human body. But he says God loves the body. Well, you see, I believe that's a mischaracterization, although I do believe that it is a view held among many futurists, that is that the body is, corrupt. But here's the point. Dr. Wright believes the human body is under the curse of Adam. Where's the difference? Now, Dr. Wright would almost immediately respond, I am sure, by saying, well, yes, it is true that the human biological body is under the curse of Adam, because after all, we still experience death. But one of these days, that human body gets transformed. Whereas in the futurist view, the body is, oh, wait a minute. In the futurist view, the body is raised. Do you see the problem here, ladies and gentlemen? On the one hand, N.T. Wright condemns the futurist for saying, oh, the human body is not necessary to go to heaven, so we put off the human body. Well, that's true. N.T. Wright believes, however, we put off the human body right now when we die and we go to heaven. N.T. Wright says, but it's necessary for Christ to come back, raise the human body, transform it into something immortal, incorruptible, undefilable. But wait a minute. That's precisely what the futurists believe. Why is Dr. Wright condemning the futurists? They both believe the human body is under the curse of Adam. They both believe that when we die, we go to heaven. They both believe that one of these days, at the so-called imaginary end of time, the physical body will be raised. Why is Dr. Wright condemning the futurist? You see the problem? Now, Dr. Wright believes, again, the human body is under the curse of Adam. But his view of resurrection has changed dramatically over the years. And it is illustrated in a host of quotes that I could give, but look, there would be a plethora of them. Now, let me simply point out to you, in his writings, he says, quote, death, pay very careful attention, which we may be right to see as a natural and harmless feature of the original landscape, now assumes, now that's because of the sin of Adam, now assumes the unwelcome guise of the executioner, coming grimly to prevent the poison spreading too far, lest they put forth their hands and take the tree of life, leads to, lest they understand one another's speech, and nothing will be impossible to them. Judgment in the present time is a matter of stopping evil in its tracks before it gets too far. Now listen very carefully. Death takes various forms. This is so revealing. Exile for Adam and Eve. So, Dr. Wright admits death for Adam and Eve was exile from the garden. All I can say to that is amen. He also says that death was the flood for Noah's generation, and it was confusion and dispersal for Babel, unquote. Now, you just have to grasp the significance of this. And by the way, in my book, The Death of Adam, the Life of Christ, as well as We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I have extensive discussion of the death of Adam. In fact, both books are almost unprecedented, especially The Death of Adam and the Life of Christ. I just recently had a conversation with an individual, and he was just amazed at the information that is in this. And by the way, I document this extensively, and I use the quotes from scholars to show how they contradict themselves in regard to their views of the death of Adam and eschatology. But enough of that. Now, I want you to think with me here. I want to pose the following with you. If physical death existed prior to sin, and N.T. Wright believes that. By the way, in my debate with Dr. David Hester, he said, in response to questions that I posed to him, is physical death the enemy? And he said physical death was a natural part of the original created order that was called very good. Whoa, hang on here. So Dr. Wright obviously believes that death existed before Adam and Eve sinned. That means the animals died before sin. Adam and Eve could see the death, physical death of the animals. How did God label death that existed prior to sin? God looked at everything that He had created and said it was good. Now look, I'm sorry, you just got to catch the power of that. If it is true, as Dr. Wright says, death originally was good, it was harmless, and it was natural, a part of the created order before sin, then that means that biological death, at least in regard to the animals, now this raises an interesting question, does it not? If biological death was part of the natural order in the animal world, and it was good, where's the indication that Adam and Eve were not likewise already subject to the same thing? After all, Dr. Wright says, death, which we may be right to see as a natural and harmless feature of the original landscape, now assumes an unwelcome guise as the executioner. There's no question that Dr. Wright, in this citation, is saying Adam and Eve were subject to physical death prior to sin. Okay, then physical death was a good thing. How could it be a good thing? Well, it meant that when Adam and Eve, had they not sinned, when they died, what would have happened? They would have gone to heaven. Obviously, if physical death was a natural part of the created order, a natural good thing as a part of the natural order, and if Adam and Eve would have died naturally, then living on earth in a utopia was not the ultimate goal of Adam and Eve's hope. Physical death was good. It was a part of the natural created order. Adam and Eve, therefore, would have died physically under no curse, under no condemnation, had they not sinned. But if they had died without sin, passed off of the human realm, they would have gone to heaven, meaning heaven was the natural primary goal, not life on earth. Listen, I'm out of time. I've got so much more. All of this is fundamental to examining Dr. Wright's view of the redemption of creation. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say this one more time. If physical death was part of the natural order, a good thing, declared so by God Himself, then without sin, man is restored to that condition where death is natural, harmless, and good. That changes everything. But I'm out of time. Again, let me urge you to go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Order a copy of my book, The Death of Adam, The Life of Christ, and We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. By the way, this book has been called The Systematic Theology of Covenant Eschatology by many of its readers. So don't forget, for the rest of January 2022, U.S. orders only, if you go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and if you order $25 or more, and that will be satisfied by these two books, you will get a 15% discount plus free shipping. Okay? Take advantage of this, and I can guarantee you, you will be blown away by how comprehensive these studies are. So, take advantage of the special offer, save yourself some serious money. In the meantime, have a fantastic and safe weekend. I'll see you on Monday.